Good morning. My name is Saket Soni. I'm a labor and community organizer. I started out in Chicago, and then when Hurricane Katrina made landfall and the levees broke, I moved to New Orleans and founded an organization called the New Orleans Workers Center. I represent some of the poorest and most vulnerable people in New Orleans, in the southern region, and now in many cities across the country. And I'm really thrilled to be here today because, let's face it, this is a time when America's promise that we all have the right to rise, that we all have the ability to aspire, that we can unlock all of our potential, that promise really has its best shot of being kept in our cities. We're at a time right now where our country is struggling to find its true north. In an increasingly connected and globalized world, our country seems to be wondering whether it wants to be a neighbor in the global village. And in the midst of so much turmoil, it's in the cities that our poorest and most vulnerable communities will be able to meet that promise. So I'm so excited to be here today to talk to all of you. And I just think that we need all the innovation we can get to solve some of society's hardest problems. And we need technology, we need smart cities, we need policy, we need solutions. But at the end of the day, those solutions have to work in the lives of our most vulnerable people. People like Alfred Marshall. When Hurricane Katrina made landfall and the levees broke, Alfred Marshall was 53 years old. He'd worked all his life, and his favorite job was a union job. He was a union cook on a Mississippi riverboat. When the floodwaters rose to the third floor of his public housing development, he rescued an 80-year-old neighbor, ferried her to safety on a floating mattress, then swam to the Superdome, from where he was taken to Texas. 2 years later, he drove back to New Orleans, and he was astonished by what he saw. As he pulled up to his old street, the city was still engulfed in darkness, and the only people he could see for miles around were immigrant workers. He looked around, he struggled to find a familiar face. He thought he saw his friend Dwight. He knew those classy clothes and that trademark hat anywhere, and he ran up to his old friend Dwight to give him a hug, to welcome a familiar face. And it wasn't Dwight. It was an immigrant worker in Dwight's clothes. Alfred was astonished. He walked back to his red pickup truck, got inside. He lived there for the next few weeks. And from behind the windscreen, he saw globalization arrive in New Orleans. Globalization from below, one immigrant at a time. The Gulf Coast, after Katrina, had turned into the world's largest construction site. And New Orleans, quite literally, became its migrant labor camp. Over the next few years, I would listen to residents of New Orleans tell the story of how they returned from exile from across the country, from Houston, even from out here in Ohio. They would return from exile years later to New Orleans and find migrant workers, sometimes 10 to 12 people to a unit, in their homes, wearing their clothes, in their communities. Now, one of those migrant workers was Danielle Castellanos. When Alfred was sleeping in his red pickup truck in Central City, thousands and thousands of miles away, Danielle was in Lima, Peru. He was facing an impossible choice. Does he live with the family he loves, or does he leave home to try to provide for them? He was staring into long months of unemployment and a financial crisis. He saw an ad in a local paper that said that labor recruiters were looking for construction workers in New Orleans. So he took a loan, paid a labor broker, received a visa, came to New Orleans, and he expected what he was promised: a good job, safe housing, and an opportunity to advance. This was America, after all. Instead, he was housed in a dark hotel that had been turned into a makeshift labor camp and was paid $6 an hour. He had been turned into a captive worker. When he came forward to report abuse and blow the whistle on wage theft and difficulties in his employment situation, he was retaliated against and threatened with deportation. As he came forward to file lawsuits against the company that had abused him, he even faced death threats. Over the next 10 years, Alfred and Danielle became organizers. They fought for the city that they together called home. They won far-reaching advances in city policy. They expanded public housing. They won wage increases for workers. They won the inclusion of African Americans in construction. They made New Orleans one of the furthest reaching sanctuary cities in the country. They turned an epicenter of trauma into a beacon of hope. In effect, they were fighting for a new social contract in New Orleans. The old social contract left them out by design. A social contract is just another word for a term for the promises we make to each other. What does the government do for its citizens, its residents, and what in return do we do for each other and with the government? What is it that binds us? What are the policies, the habits, the behaviors? What are the ways we see each other, talk to each other, talk about each other? What's the promise that keeps us together as one country, one society? Well, the old contract was based on the value of full-time work. When the New Deal was being negotiated, activists actually had a very expansive vision of the kind of social contract they wanted. Communities were fighting for anti-lynching laws. Communities were fighting for vast increases in publicly funded housing that would be integrated. Communities were fighting for a jobs guarantee and for universal benefits. In effect, in 1936, communities across the United States were fighting for the society we still very much strive for. But in 1936, Southern lawmakers controlled most of the committees of Congress and vetoed the New Deal until they won the extraction of people like Danielle and Alfred. They won the exclusion of a largely Southern workforce, largely descended from slaves, farm workers, domestic workers, casual laborers, workers in the newly emerging service economy, public sector workers. These workers were excluded because they had been historically controlled by a Southern labor market, by forces in the Southern political economy of race that didn't want to easily give up that control. Many of these workers, farm workers, for example, or day laborers, were really the original workers of the gig economy. The idea that part-time work, the idea that subcontracted work or freelancing wouldn't be covered by the old social contract was a defining victory of the Southern coalition that vetoed the New Deal until these workers were excluded. As a result, these workers wound up in the margins of the economy. The difference now is that these workers have gone from the margins to become an emerging majority. Look around you in your own city, wherever you are. The day laborer, the domestic worker, the Uber driver, the freelancer, all of these together are a new emerging workforce. They need a new social contract. Now, I do believe there's hope. I'm an optimist as well. And I think that it's possible to get to a new deal for the new working majority, but I think it's a generation away. And that's why I'm excited to be here today, because it is going to take the best minds of our generation, and we will have to make it the work of our generation to secure a future for our country's emerging workforce, an increasingly diverse, increasingly young, increasingly precarious, and anxious workforce. Well, the workers that the New Deal was written for today are increasingly precarious and anxious as well. They know that the old social contract isn't working for them either. The disappearance of full-time standard work and the emergence of new forms of labor and the emergence of new communities means that new social contract is needed for all of us. And I think the breakthroughs in the next 10 years will come from epicenters, epicenters like New Orleans. Climate change and inequality turned New Orleans into a traumatic epicenter. At the time, it unmasked American inequality in a shocking way for many people. Today, though, the inequality is apparent and all around us. Epicenters are everywhere, not just Houston after Harvey, not just Jacksonville and Miami after Irma, not just Puerto Rico and the California Sonoma Valley, but even in your own city, every poor neighborhood, every community under siege, every community that is locked into an exploitative economy or locked out of the labor market altogether is an epicenter of trauma. Well, what would happen if we really tried to make each of these epicenters beacons of hope? Let's look at the scale of these epicenters. In the county that houses Houston, about 140,000 homes were flooded by Hurricane Harvey. Jacksonville lost 25% of its housing in the worst flooding it has seen in 150 years because of Hurricane Irma. The combined total damage that these hurricanes did is estimated to be as much as $100 to $200 billion. There is vast rebuilding to be done. And that rebuilding is real, but it's also a metaphor for the rebuilding that our country needs, the rebuilding that all of our cities need. Well, what if we envisioned a just reconstruction? What if there was a Green Deal for Houston or Jacksonville or the Gulf Coast or the country that placed worker dignity as a centerpiece? You know, we could start by ensuring that workers like Danielle, coming from across the world to help people come home, to work on the reconstruction, are given emergency protected status so that their immigration status is not used against them, so that they're not at the bottom of the floor in a race to the bottom in these turbulent economies post-disaster. We could also ensure that people like Alfred coming home to their communities are given a much bigger safety net that exists for them right now. If Alfred and every person returning home to New Orleans, if every person returning home to Houston and Jacksonville received not just unemployment insurance, but vastly expanded social protections and social insurance to help them get on their feet during what is going to be a decade of economic volatility in their lives because of disaster, then these communities would be much more secure. And with these two things in place, immigrant communities and their new resident hosts would be able to partner much better. We could go a little further, and we could imagine that the workforce in these disaster zones could come together as a vast resilience corps. Imagine in your own city a combined workforce that is guaranteed wages, safety net, and dignity, that includes everyone involved in the reconstruction, not just construction workers, but day laborers, teachers, counselors, cultural workers, domestic workers, healthcare workers, bus captains, engineers, innovators. It takes a vast workforce to help a family come home and rebuild an American city. And a resilience corps that's connected, that's innovative, and that's treated with dignity that it deserves could be central to a just reconstruction. The old social contract that excluded Danielle, Alfred, and people like them was based on the fundamental value of full-time paid work. The problem is not everybody had that work, and fewer people will have it going forward in the future. Women and people of color in particular, but increasing numbers of workers who were in the last majority will not be secure in the next generation through the old social contract. So the new social contract really has to be based on a new set of values. And those values need to come from deep inside the communities that are the most vulnerable. Those values, in my book, are economic security, climate resilience, and social trust. If a new social contract is written from inside these traumatic epicenters, it needs to deliver more than merely the promise of wages, good conditions at work, and a basically adequate social safety net. The new social contract will have to deliver a new sense of belonging, a new sense of home, at a time when many Americans feel like strangers in their own land. They look around and they feel that cities don't work for them. Society doesn't work for them. The rules that are written don't work for them. They feel like exiles in the political economy. One last story. When I met Alfred and Danielle, they were the emblematic exiles in the political economy. Alfred told me the story of how one day, a year or so after his return, he stood across a chain link fence on his street and watched as a wrecking ball brought down the public housing development that he called home. And as he looked at the place he grew up, the place that was his community, his environment, the place that was everything he knew, as he looked at each wall falling down, with each wall that fell, he felt that a part of him had crashed away, fallen away, lost forever. At his lowest point, he walked up to the chain link fence and asked a worker across the fence to throw him a brick. The worker did, and Alfred held on to a little piece of home with nothing else but a memento for his 53 years in New Orleans. But in the next 10 years, Alfred and Danielle, who started in a place where their own personal dignity was their only infrastructure, in the next 10 years, they turned New Orleans into a beacon city. And as our country struggles to find its future, cities like New Orleans, because of people like Danielle and Alfred, will be our passport to the next society we want, the America we want to live in. I have a lot of hope in that America because I believe in Alfred, Danielle, and the resilience of people like them in these communities. So as we work on innovative ideas, as we work on urban sustainability and technology, as we think about the uses of technology and data and all of these things, which are beautiful and fun to think about, which are fascinating, cutting-edge ideas. I think the real question for us is, how can these solutions work in the lives of the people who have the least, but who want to be the America that all of us aspire to live in? City by city, I believe change is possible. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Saket. Fantastic.
Appreciate it.